Nature smiled more benignly on the pioneers of New England than on their disease plagued fellow colonists of the South. In this unit, we will discuss how the environment and geography impacted New England settlement and the society comparatively to the Chesapeake Bay colonies. The story of New England was largely written in rocks. Cultivating the heavily glaciated soil of this region was backbreaking work. Each winter, countless stones were forced to the surface of the fields by hard freezing. Puritans did not possess the soil, it possessed them by shaping their hard working character, something that became known as the Protestant work ethic. As stories of this unforgiving terrain of New England reached Europe, fewer non-English immigrants migrated to this region, electing for Pennsylvania instead. As a consequence, New England was less ethnically mixed than the southern and middle colonies. The harsh climate also molded New England. Because of the extremes of weather, crops like tobacco that the Pilgrims had intended on growing in Virginia did not flourish as it did in the South. Farming could only exist on a small scale, subsistence level. This reality, while devastating the first settlers, would actually be a blessing in disguise. First of all, it meant that New England would not come to rely on black slavery, as it could not exist profitably on small farms. Secondly, the inability to conduct plantation farming led these people to seek their fortunes in other industries. Fishing, fur trading, logging, and shipping all became valuable New England trades. The fishy gold mines of New England's harbor yielded more wealth than all the treasure chests of the Aztec. The old State House of Massachusetts is in fact mounted by a golden codfish. The Pilgrims firmly believed that their new home in North America was a gift from God. The wilderness was evidence that the natives were savage and not privy to God's gifts. As discussed in Chapter 3, New Englanders pushed native people westward as they settled in the new territory. Civilizing the wilderness required clearing woodlands for pastures and cultivation, building roads, and importing thousands of heads of domesticated animals. All of this had a serious environmental impact. The compacting of the soil by herds of cows, pigs, and sheep and horses, along with the cutting down of forests, led to significant soil erosion, which hurt the colony's ability to farm. Geographers believe that it has even led to a climate change resulting in more extreme temperature highs and lows. Geographers believe that it even led to climate change resulting in more extreme temperatures, high and low. Because of a disproportionate number of New Englanders migrating, seeking religious freedom as their primary motive, they weren't all from the same desperate lot that had migrated to Virginia seeking financial survival. Most white migrants to the New England area came with their families and were neither from the richest nor the poorest classes in Europe. They brought their skills, ambition, and intelligence with them. While some of these well-to-do settlers of the northern colonies would attempt to recreate feudal society of Europe, the crude frontier did not permit it. The hard work required to survive was a great equalizer. Like Bacon's rebellion in Virginia, New York experienced class conflict at the end of the 17th century as well. Leisler's rebellion was an armed conflict between aspiring merchants led by Jacob Leisler and the ruling elite of New York. This was one of many conflicts across the colonies that erupted when wealthy colonists attempted to recreate European social structure in the New World. Efforts to reproduce the finely stratified societies of Europe proved feeble in the early American experience, where equality and democracy found fertile soil, at least for white people. All in all, the quality of life in New England was better than that of anywhere else in the British Empire. Settlers there lived an average of 10 years longer than their British counterparts. The average life expectancy wasn't much different from what it is today, about 70 years. Family was the center of New England society, and because of that, the population of New England grew rapidly from natural reproduction. Women tended to marry in their early 20s and bear children every 2 years until menopause. This means that a woman that survived childbirth had an average of 10 children in her lifetime. Because of their longevity, New England is said to have invented grandparents. The Life and Death in Colonial America by Prudence Punderson. Note that the artist's initials, PP, are on the coffin. This embroidery suggests the stoic resolve of a colonial woman, calmly depicted in the inevitable progression of her own life, from the cradle to the grave. Mrs. Elizabeth Freak and Baby Mary. This portrait is of the Boston mother and her child in 1674, suggesting the strong family ties that characterized early New England society. Mary Myrick Davy. This woman exemplified the longevity of New Englanders. She bore 9 children, buried 3 husbands, and was still performing household tasks past the age of 100. As discussed in Chapter 3, John Winthrop envisioned Massachusetts Bay would be a model of Christian charity, or a utopia to the rest of the world. The covenant the Puritans believed they had with God led them to establish a theocracy. In this section, we will see how the objectives and practices of the Puritans led to participatory democracy in town hall meetings. The religious and social goals of the Puritans, combined with the pressures placed upon them by their environment, led New Englanders to form tightly knit communities and a culture of unity. Unlike the lone wolf planters that established isolated plantations, Puritan leaders centered their communities around the church. A proprietor who received a land grant from a colony to build a town was required to build the town according to a very rigid model. At the town's center, a meeting house, which would serve as both the place of worship and the town hall, was built. Each village was to have a green, an open space where the militia could drill. Each family of the town was given several parcels of land, including a wood lot, arable land for growing crops, and pasture land for grazing animals. Towns of over 50 citizens were required to build an elementary school to teach children the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic. Puritan society placed a premium on education because it wanted their citizens to be able to read the Bible. In fact, Massachusetts Bay erected the first college in North America. In 1636, Harvard College was founded as a seminary school for training ministers. Virginia would establish a college in the South 60 more years later. Virginia wouldn't establish a college in the South for 60 more years. Though the seeds of democracy were sown in New England, it did not mean unfettered liberty. Women were not allowed to vote, preach, or hold public office. Their sphere of influence was largely reserved for the home. Above all else, the laws of Puritan New England sought to defend the integrity of God's laws, especially marriage. Divorce was very rare, and authorities could forcibly require a separated couple to reunite. Among few exceptions, divorce could be granted to a woman if her husband had outright abandoned his family. Adultery was another instance, but the law was especially harsh on infidelity. If convicted, an adulterer could be whipped in the public square, forced to wear a capital letter A on the outer parts of their garments for the rest of their life. Spousal abuse was not a divorceable offense, but authorities could intervene to restrain an abusive husband. Jail or public humiliation was a common prescription for crimes of immorality. Laws designed to protect women from spousal abuse speak to the beginning of a women's rights movement in the start of the 1600s. Though New England women were protected by law from domestic abuse and were allowed to serve in special occupations like midwifery, they were not allowed to own property if they were married. This was in remarkable contrast to the women in the South because of how fragile disease and death made Southern families. A widow was allowed to retain separate title to property and inherit their husband's estates in the South, even if they were remarried. New England women lost control of their dead husband's property if they were to remarry. John Winthrop's ambition to establish a Massachusetts as a city upon a hill greatly influenced the culture and politics of Massachusetts Bay when it was first established in 1630. But over the next 70 years, migration would lead to social change and loosen the grip Calvinism had over New England, resulting in one of the most notorious events in American history, the Salem witch trials. From the outset, Puritans made up a minority of the settlers in New England, but their political monopoly slipped as New England fanned out and non-Puritan settlers from the Netherlands, Germany, Sweden, and England joined their community. Puritan clergy rallied against the social change and with scathing sermons that scolded their congregations for their community's waning piety. These passionate sermons became known as the Jeremiad, after the prophet Jeremiah. These doomsday sermons may have been having the opposite effect on church attendance because enrollments to the congregation and the number of conversion testimonials that were being given on Sunday were way down. In an effort to correct this problem, congregational ministers announced in 1662 that they would allow the children of unconverted attendees of the church to be baptized. This partial membership, or halfway covenant, diluted the purity of the church. This is a colonial primer, a religious instruction book. This textbook taught lessons of social duty and Christian faith, as well as lessons on reading and writing. Eventually, the church welcomed anyone, converted or not, as members, blurring the distinction between the elect and the other members of society. The halfway covenant allowed for more participation in church and civic affairs, especially to women who were quickly becoming the majority of new church members. The dilution of piety in the church also loosened the grip of theocracy in New England, which set the stage for one of American history's most notorious conflicts. The dilution of piety in the church also loosened the grip of theocracy in New England, which set the stage for one of American history's most notorious conflicts, the Salem witch trials. As ministers and Puritan lawmakers lost their influence on their increasingly secular society, they continued to blame social unrest or colonial troubles on the sinfulness of the people living there and those who failed to uphold the model of a Christian charity. They used their power to harshly punish people convicted of spiritual crimes like witchcraft. Witchcraft persecutions had been common at this time in Europe, but not so much in America. This time, people from all parts of the social spectrum used the Inquisitions as a way to scapegoat, air grievances, or get retribution on their enemies. This image is of Matthew Hopkins, a witch finder. Hopkins was a 17th century English witch hunter whose techniques included watching suspects to see if diabolical creatures in the form of common animals fed on the alleged witch's blood. He also urged that suspects be bound hand and foot and tossed into a pond. The innocent, he claimed, would sink and often drowned, while the guilty would float to the surface, and so they could be executed. His methods brought death to hundreds of women, men, and children in eastern England in the 1640s. This is what happened in 1692, when a group of girls claimed that they had been bewitched when they themselves were accused of dancing and conjuring spirits in a nearby wood. At first, the targets of the Salem witch trials were poorer members of the community that were mostly women and unattached to the church. Eventually, property owners, many of whom were motivated by land disputes with their neighbors, accused one another. In all, 19 people and 2 dogs were hanged. One man was even pressed to death, a process where large stones were laid upon his chest until he was crushed. This was done because he refused to cooperate with the court's investigation. The Salem witch trials were finally and permanently suspended when the wife of the presiding judge was accused. It would take 20 years before the government of Massachusetts acknowledged it had been wrong and annulled the convictions and made reparations to the families of the convicted. But for those that were killed or driven off their land, this was too late. The value of the witch trials are twofold. First, it added the metaphor witch hunting into the American lexicon to describe a dangerous and irrational urge to find a scapegoat. And it's also an example of violence caused by social resentment that at the time came with the end of Puritan theocracy. The overwhelming majority of American colonists, regardless of whether they were in the North or the South, had to practice some level of subsistence farming. The cycle of the seasons dictated their schedules. Daily tasks were assigned to gender and age. Women wove, cooked, cleaned, and cared for children. Men cleared the land, fenced, planted, cut firewood, and butchered livestock. Children helped with all of these tasks, and if there was enough time and they were fortunate, they got a little learning as well. Life in the American colonies was humble, but it was comfortable compared to Europe because land was cheap and abundant. An acre of virgin soil cost what it would take an American carpenter to earn in one day's wages, which was roughly 3 times as much as a person could earn in England.